And Then There Were None is the best-selling murder mystery book of all time, but is it worth the hype? Does it hold up over 80 years after it's been released, particularly to someone like me who doesn't really like, murder mysteries and stuff like that? There's a lot to love about this book, and I can really see why it's a classic, why it did so well. But it's not perfect. There's plenty of flaws which I found, which didn't quite take me out of the story, but, definitely played on my mind a little bit as I was reading it. In this video, I'm just going to go through, first of all, a non-spoiler, quick, brief review of what I thought, general thoughts, what the book is. And then I'm going to get into spoilers, get into what makes this a classic, what made it so successful, what kind of distinguishes it from a bloated market, which obviously wasn't so bloated when it came out 90 odd years ago, but it is now. And as someone who's not a murder mystery fan, I went into it kind of like, is this going to be an old book which has fallen off a bit? Well, to me, it hasn't. Okay, so in terms of a non-spoiler review, it's got a simple premise. You've got your quite a large cast of characters, about 10 characters, no singular main character. They're all put onto one island. This is all first chapter stuff. They're all going to one island with a bit of like a mysterious sort of premise around it. There's a bit of mystery already from the start. And, they get there, something's not right. And Agatha Christie really creates these characters so well because it's such a challenge, which she actually acknowledges at the start of the book, to create a book with 10 main characters and not make one of them seem underdeveloped, not make one of them stand out. And I really think she achieved that. And beyond the characters, there's the setting, which she makes really become a character within itself and really add to the book. And then there's the theme and the tone, particularly the tone. Obviously, for a mystery novel, the tension is important. And I think she really nailed the tension. I really did not want to put this book down. I wanted to keep reading it. And yeah, it really ticked all the boxes for a murder mystery for me. So if you haven't read it, I recommend reading it, going in blind. I skipped over the author's note at the start because I thought she might spoil a little bit of it. Obviously not badly, but for me, I'm quite sensitive to spoilers, so just read the book. That's my recommendation. So I'm going to get into spoilers now. Not from the start. I'm not going to say like straight away what happens, but just a bit more detail. So what I like about this book is that it takes a bunch of kind of stock characters. Your like gruff old man, your retired policeman, your, female school teacher, your old lady who's like really religious, etc. There's loads of quite on the surface basic characters, and then as the story goes on, you realize she kind of uses that to just as a tool to make you understand them quickly, which she needs to do because this is a short book with 10 murders in it basically. So character development at the start has to be quick. So she uses these archetypes, but then she kind of twists on them and kind of develops them a lot more than you'd expect maybe. I think like going into it, I was like, oh, these are kind of boring characters. What's all the fuss about? But then at a crucial point, which I would say is when you find out about all of their crimes, that's when they all kind of get a bit more fleshed out and they become more compelling. So that's definitely one of the achievements of this book, is the 10 character cast, all fleshed out, all morally grey. You kind of like them and dislike them. The ones which have done the worst sort of crimes aren't necessarily the most unlikable. In fact, for my case, I found probably the person who's done the least heinous crime to be one of the most dislikable, less sympathetic characters, and that was Emily Brent. She's the religious one, and her crime is kind of negligence and like not caring for someone under her employ, but she didn't really do anything to cause the death of someone else. She was just unkind, and it's kind of more her attitude which makes her unlikable. And I think obviously this is on purpose, and this is contrasted with Vera Claythorne, who her crime is a lot worse. Someone under her care, she deliberately let a child die, and yet she's a more sympathetic character because she kind of obsesses over it and at least seems to have some sort of conscience. even though that's kind of debatable anyway, she doesn't really feel guilty that the child died. She feels guilty that the person that she let the child die for no longer loves her and is no longer in her life. So I think Agatha Christie kind of uses this to explore the fact that as readers, we can look past what someone's done. One character who's done way worse things and is morally worse, which is debatable, but it's barely debatable, is actually much more likable than a character who's kind of not really done that much bad, but it's just kind of not a likable character. And it's kind of an exploration of morality and like how we can sympathize with someone who's done something so bad. So with the characters, the introductory scene, I really liked it. Like, it's all on the train, they're all in the same setting, except for the couple of people who are like in a car. But you just get a short little snippet of each character, why they're going where they're going, who they are, and their character voice is so distinct. It's all done in omniscient narrator, but, you know, flicking between each character's point of view. So you get into their heads, you get to see what they're thinking. And this is used throughout in such a clever way to give red herrings, to make you think, is it this person? They're acting kind of weird, they're thinking kind of weird things, but then you see that they're clueless, so no, it's not them. And even if you try and figure it out, I didn't figure out who the killer was. I don't think you're supposed to in this book. And I'm sure a lot of mystery fans don't like that, but for me, that's fine. I still enjoyed it. I loved the reveal. I had some nitpicks with it, but it was still good. Another interesting part is that the killer decided to leave the people who had, by his judgment, committed the worst crimes to the last. So they experienced the most stress of the situation. And that was like an interesting exploration of guilt and morality, because the people, they've all caused the death of someone. And the first one to die is someone who's actually killed two people, but he feels no guilt. So the justification for that is that, you know, he feels no guilt. There's no point in putting him through this stress because he has no conscience. Whereas the last couple of people all killed someone who they kind of had a duty of care for. And that's something that the killer is really preoccupied with, is an abuse of power. So the general abused his power to send a soldier to his death. And, you know, the doctor abused his power by being hungover or drunk and operating on someone and therefore killing them. And then it's even more contrasted when you get to Vera and Lombard, because Lombard doesn't feel any guilt for what he did, even though he like caused the death of 21 or 24, 20-something people who to him, he kind of sees them as beneath him because he's like racist. And obviously this was written in the 1930s, so it was more acceptable then, and that would have been less of a factor that makes a character less sympathetic. So he doesn't feel guilty because he's like, I needed to do it for survival, and he is just purely practical in that sense. And then he's contrasted with Vera, who, even though her guilt isn't properly well established in the fact that she's not like, I can't believe the boy died, she's more like, I can't believe that boy dying got in the way of my love, which is so heinous and so dislikable. But somehow Agatha Christie contrasts that with the less likable characters to make you still root for Vera in some ways, and just making her, I guess, maybe the most main character of them all, because I haven't looked it up, but I guess that she probably has more than the other characters of like POV parts. And I think that kind of helps you see her descent into stress and like almost madness, and that makes you kind of sympathize with her a lot more. But it's really interesting, that contrast between Lombard and her, and how she eventually admits it to Lombard, and at that point she can't live with the guilt and the stress of it being out, and she ends up killing him, and then she ends up doing the killer's job for him at the end. And that is like the kind of culmination of the guilt and the stress of it all, you know. And then that's also contrasted with the general, who his guilt, he has the opposite reaction, you know. Once it comes out, once it's played through the gramophone, his crimes, he has a weight off his shoulder, and he goes and sits by the sea and like relaxes and feels freed of his conscience, which, you know, it's just an interesting exploration of guilt and morality and how different people process different things. Another interesting thing that I liked throughout was her use of like animalistic descriptions, which she particularly used for Philip Lombard from the start. She kind of says he has like a wolf-like smile. And I think part of that is like a bit of a red herring to be like, oh, you know, a wolf is kind of like a predator. He's a lone wolf amongst the pack. He's the one, he's the killer. So hinting at that. And then when he's one of the last two, you know, it really does kind of hint at that. But by that point, you're almost convinced it can't be him because of the POV that you get from him. You know, his thoughts, you can see it's not. You know it's not either of them. Unless something like weird's going on. So you're really fascinated by it. You're really intrigued by it. And that's something I love. And then that is kind of developed throughout. And then at the end, the climax of this point is Vera seeing that wolf-like smile. And she's like, oh, he's not a man. He's a wolf, like he's a predator. And that's when you're like, oh, shit, is he the killer? Like, I don't know, I love that. And those animalistic descriptions of the characters are used beyond just Lombard, even though he's the recurring one. It was used so well in this one like short passage where, I can't remember whose point of view it was, but they see everyone and they kind of see them as animals. And I guess this is the descent from the human conscious, sure, and like in control through guilt to being let loose and kind of accepting yourself. And I found that really interesting when, you know, it describes the judge as like looking around like an old tortoise, and the policeman as a slow padding animal with a mixture of stupidity and ferocity. It's just a really interesting description, you know. I think Vera Claythorne was described as a bird who'd just flown into a window and was like dazed and kind of staying still in danger. And that really characterized them all so well. Even though you got the characters by now, it kind of like, it's just a perfect example of the distinguishment between the characters, which is just so well done. Now, the setting is another thing in this book which does wonders for the enjoyment and also for the themes of the book. So they're on this island, they're isolated. Okay, that's kind of obvious. Not tropey, but maybe tropey, you know. But obviously that feeling of trappedness and, you know, isolation really does add to the suspense. That's obvious. But it's done so well, particularly with the storm, particularly with them looking around and not seeing anything. And that's the main thing about this setting, is the house isn't some creaky old thing with like doors going everywhere and like secret passages. They really focus on the fact that it's a modern house with no room to hide, no secrets that could be held in there, and a small island, again, with no room to hide. And then that's kind of like a play for the theme of there being no room to hide from your guilt. Once it's kind of projected out there, no, you're not hiding anymore. You're not hiding from what you've done. This is what the judge wanted them to come to terms with what they've done, and for their crimes to be, you know, broadcast to the world. And that's, you know, reflected in the setting, which is really clever. And not only does it help reflect that, but it also just adds to the tension. And it's just so cleverly done. I loved that part. And then the reveal. Now, the reveal obviously is one of the most crucial aspects, potentially the most crucial aspect of a mystery book. Did she achieve what she wanted to achieve with the reveal? Now, for me, yes, she did, but I can see where people wouldn't like it. There are definitely some nitpicky problems there, which I call them nitpicks, but I think a lot of people might be taken out of the book by them. I know this wasn't a book you're supposed to work out who the killer was. I don't think you could. Maybe some people do if you're really astute, but I certainly wasn't astute enough. I had no idea. There were definitely points where I suspected the judge, but there were points where I suspected everyone, to be honest. So, yeah, I was satisfied with the reveal. The explanation was fun. I liked really played into the theme of morality, which obviously it's not new, you know, a vigilante justice kind of thing. But it fits with the judge, you know, who dishes out justice. And it does make sense with how like calm he was going through it, even though that made sense without knowing because of his character, because he's dealt with death before. So that was interesting. And I thought it was well done. I loved the Scotland Yard people kind of dragging it out beforehand. Like, so who killed him then? Just before the reveal, when you think you're going to get it, you get an extra bit of people like umming and ahhing, which if you're not into the book at this point would be annoying, but I was, so it was tense and it was fun and I liked it. A few of the problems, I guess, were there were a few coincidences that were definitely relied upon, like the storm. Like, he didn't have any idea. I guess he could look at the weather forecast and see that there's a storm coming, but I can't imagine that was very accurate back in those days. And that was definitely very convenient. And another thing is him faking his own death was maybe, I mean, I was okay to believe it. I'm someone who's quite lenient with my room for suspension of disbelief, so I was okay believing that. But him pretending to be dead and then having his body carried upstairs by a policeman and a kind of gun for hire who are both very familiar with corpses, I don't know how much that kind of holds up, but ultimately it made for a fun kind of reveal, so I was okay with it. And then the other thing that I didn't really know if I believed was Vera snatching the gun from Lombard at the end. Like, there's no way he would let that happen. He's on edge. He's a professional. The whole book is talking about his instincts and stuff and how he's like the most athletic one there. And then that happens. I just don't know if that's completely believable. But ultimately, those didn't detract enough from the book for me to not enjoy it. I still had a great time with it. And honestly, I would give it probably an 8 out of 10, I'd say. It's not perfect. It was enjoyable. As someone who doesn't read murder mysteries, this has made me want to read more. So yeah, I'm glad I read it. I reckon you should read it too. I might make a few more videos on it, maybe go a bit deeper into kind of the themes and the setting and the characters, but I might leave it at that. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. So yeah, I read this book just to branch away from my normal genre. I read a lot of fantasy and I'm trying to write a book. Well, not trying to write a book, I am writing a book, which is in that genre of fantasy, sort of historical sort of area. And I wanted to broaden my horizons and at least, get a bit of inspiration from other genres. And I'm really glad I did, because this is written so differently to not just fantasy books, but to books these days. This is so uniquely written. It's so fun. It's so sharp. It's so fast paced. And I loved it. And I think I learned a lot from it. And I really think anyone who wants to be a writer with a book with any sort of mystery could probably benefit from reading a book like this. Yeah, I recommend it.